Power has a sound. In the hushed halls of finance, it's the silent nod that closes a billion-dollar deal. On Wall Street, it's the deafening roar of the opening bell. But on a crisp October evening in the opulent dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, Aurelia Power was about to have a very different sound, a scream of pure rage. This is the story of Arthur Vance, a man whose net worth was eclipsed only by his arrogance, a titan who could buy anything except his own past. And this is the story of Isabella Rossi, the waitress who served him a dish of long-forgotten justice, seasoned with a single devastating sentence that would bring the world of the 1% to a dead silent halt. Aurelia was not a restaurant. It was a testament to earthly perfection. Tucked away on a quiet, cobblestone street in Soho, it had no sign, only a single, perfectly polished brass number on an ancient oak door. Getting a reservation required a combination of fame, fortune, and a connection to someone who had already dined there. It was a self-perpetuating ecosystem of the elite. Tonight, its apex predator had arrived. Arthur Vance did not walk into a room. He consumed it. At 63, he was a monolith of tailored Italian wool and unforgiving ambition. His hair was a shock of silver, perfectly coiffed, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing and forgave less. He was the founder and CEO of Vance Global Properties, a real estate empire built on the foundations of crushed competitors and shrewd, often brutal acquisitions. His name was a verb in the industry. To be Vanced was to be utterly and irrevocably wiped off the map. He was dining with two junior partners, Liam and Marcus, a pair of eager, Armani-clad sycophants who laughed a little too loudly at his non-jokes and agreed with his pronouncements as if they were gospel. "The service has slipped," Arthur declared, his voice a low rumble that cut through the soft clinking of cutlery. He hadn't even tasted the amuse-bouche yet. "There's a hesitation in the air, a lack of precision." Liam nodded vigorously. "I noticed it too, Arthur, a definite laxity." The manager, a perpetually composed Frenchman named Mr. Dubois, glided to their table. "Mr. Vance, an honor, as always. Is everything to your satisfaction?" Arthur looked at Dubois as if he were a particularly uninteresting insect. "Your hostess seated us 45 seconds after our reservation time, Jean-Pierre. Precision. It's the bedrock of any successful enterprise. Yours appears to be crumbling." Mr. Dubois' professional smile didn't waver, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "My deepest apologies, sir. It will not happen again." He retreated with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to placating gods and monsters. Across the room, Isabella Rossi tied the knot on her crisp black apron. She was 24, though the exhaustion in her eyes sometimes made her look older. She was in her second year at Columbia Law, and the tuition, even with a partial scholarship, was a mountain she was climbing one grueling shift at a time. Aurelia was the highest peak for a server in New York City. The pay was phenomenal, the tips legendary, but it came at a price. You served the most demanding, powerful, and often cruelest people on the planet. She watched Arthur Vance from a distance. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. His face was plastered on business magazines, his latest mega tower altering the city's skyline. For most, he was an icon of success. For Isabella, he was a ghost who had haunted her family's dinner table for 15 years, a name spoken in whispers of anger and sorrow. "Table 7 is yours, Bella," her colleague whispered, nodding towards Vance's party. Leo was supposed to take it, but he saw Vance's name on the reservation and nearly had a panic attack. He spilled a tray of water glasses in the kitchen. Isabella felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. "All right," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm raging within her. "I've got it." She picked up her notepad, took a deep centering breath, and began the long walk across the velvet-carpeted floor. Each step was a step back in time, back to a small brick-fronted bakery in Brooklyn, the smell of fresh bread, her father's flour-dusted hands, and the day a man in a sharp suit, a much younger Arthur Vance, had taped a notice to their door and shattered their world. She arrived at the table, her face a mask of professional calm. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and even. "My name is Isabella, and I will be your server tonight. May I begin with our wine selection? Arthur Vance didn't even look up from his phone. He simply waved a dismissive hand. The sommelier has already failed. Bring me a bottle of the 98 Chateau Margaux, and make sure it's decanted for exactly 20 minutes. Not 19, not 21. 20. Isabella held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His eyes, cold and dismissive, swept over her and registered nothing but a uniform. To him, she was not a person. She was a function, a pair of hands to deliver his demands. The knot in her stomach tightened. It was perfect. He had absolutely no idea who she was. The dinner was a masterclass in casual cruelty. Arthur Vance treated the meal as a battlefield and Isabella as his primary adversary. The Margaux, decanted under her watchful eye for precisely 20 minutes, was deemed passable, but lacking the vigor of the 96. The seared foie gras was a shade too timid. The lobster bisque, he claimed, had a singularly uninspired flavor profile. With each complaint, Isabella simply nodded, her expression placid. I am very sorry to hear that, sir. I will let the chef know. Her composure seemed to enrage him more than any argument could have. He was a man who fed on reactions, fear from his underlings, anger from his rivals, awe from the public. Isabella's serene professionalism gave him no purchase. He was firing cannons at a fortress of fog. His partners, Liam and Marcus, watched the exchange with a mixture of terror and glee. They were witnessing the Vance treatment firsthand, a legendary display of dominance they usually only heard about in boardroom lore. They chimed in with their own sycophantic critiques, echoing their boss's sentiments like a Greek chorus of yes men. Yes, the bisque is pedestrian, Marcus offered, having moments earlier declared it the best he'd ever had. Isabella moved with an economy of motion that belied the frantic pounding of her heart. She cleared plates, refilled water glasses, and answered questions about the menu with flawless recall. Inside, however, a slideshow of memories was playing on a loop. Her father, a proud Italian immigrant named Marco Rossi, standing in the rubble of his bakery, the demolition crew working behind him. The legal papers on their kitchen table, filled with impenetrable jargon that boiled down to one simple fact. They were losing everything. The look in her mother's eyes as she took on a second, then a third cleaning job. This was all because of a subsidiary of Vance Global Properties. It had been one of Arthur Vance's first major hostile takeovers in that part of Brooklyn. He wanted the block for a luxury condo development. The Rossi Bakery, a neighborhood institution for 40 years, was just a line item on a spreadsheet, an obstacle to be cleared. The buyout offer was insultingly low. When her father refused, Vance's lawyers had found an obscure zoning loophole, a forgotten clause in the original lease from the 1950s, and they had exploited it with surgical precision. They hadn't just bought the property, they had legally suffocated it. Her father had fought back. He had poured their life savings into a legal battle he could never win. The stress had destroyed his health. He suffered a massive heart attack a year after they lost the bakery and died at 52. The official cause was cardiac arrest. Isabella knew the real cause was a broken heart. Miss? Vance's sharp voice snapped her back to the present. He was holding up his empty wine glass, wiggling it impatiently. Are you being paid to daydream or to serve? My apologies, sir, Isabella said, her voice dangerously quiet. She took the bottle and poured the deep red liquid with a steady hand, stopping at the perfect level. As she served the main course, a dry-aged New York strip for Vance, cooked medium rare, seared at a high temperature to create a perfect crust, rested for 10 minutes. She felt a change in the atmosphere. Vance was no longer just being difficult. He was hunting for a mistake. He was looking for a reason to unleash the full force of his legendary temper. He wanted to make an example of someone. The opportunity came from the most innocent of sources. Leo, the young waiter who had been too scared to take the table, was now working the adjacent section. He was barely 20, a culinary student with wide, nervous eyes and hands that sometimes trembled when holding a full tray. As he was clearing a nearby table, his foot caught on the leg of a chair. It was a tiny stumble, but his tray, laden with used water goblets, tilted precariously. A single splash of ice water arced through the air, and landed squarely on the sleeve of Arthur Vance's custom-tailored Xenia jacket. It was only a few drops, a minor accident, but in the silent, pressurized chamber of Aurelia, it was the sound of a detonator clicking into place. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The soft jazz from the hidden speakers faded into nothingness. The gentle murmur of conversation died. Every eye in the room swiveled towards table 7. Arthur Vance looked down at the dark spots on his gray wool sleeve as if he'd been splattered with acid. He didn't move. He just stared. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Leo stood frozen, his face ashen. The tray trembled in his hands. I'm so sorry, sir, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. It was an accident. I'll get a cloth right away. Vance slowly lifted his head. His face was a thundercloud. The artificial bonhomie he had maintained with his partners was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it was so full of venom that it seemed to suck the air out of the room. An accident? He hissed. You think this is about an accident? He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. He was a tall man, and he loomed over the terrified young waiter like a bird of prey. This jacket, Vance said, his voice rising in volume with each word, cost more than you will make in a year. But that's not the point. The point is incompetence. The point is that this establishment, which charges a fortune for the privilege of dining here, employs clumsy, inept children like you. Leo was visibly shaking now, tears welling in his eyes. Sir, please. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't dry clean a $10,000 suit, Vance roared. The sound was shocking in the refined space. People at other tables physically flinched. Sorry doesn't compensate for the disruption to my evening. Sorry is the word that failures use when they have nothing else to offer. Mr. Dubois was now rushing towards the table, his face a mask of horrified diplomacy. Mr. Vance, I beg your pardon. Please allow us to take care of everything. The entire meal is on the house, of course, and we will have the jacket professionally restored at our expense. Vance wasn't listening. He had his prey, and he was going in for the kill. He jabbed a finger at Leo's chest. You! What's your name? Leo, sir, the boy whispered. Well, Leo, Vance spat the name out like poison. I hope you enjoyed your last night working in a respectable establishment, because I will personally see to it that you never serve so much as a cup of coffee in this city again. I will call every owner I know. I will make sure your name is blacklisted from every restaurant, every hotel, every catering company from here to the Hamptons. You are finished. Do you understand me? Leo let out a small, choked sob, unable to speak, and that's when Isabella stepped forward. She moved between Vance and Leo, a small, quiet shield. She didn't touch Vance, but her presence was a physical interruption, a sudden and unexpected act of defiance. That's enough, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, firm, and cut through Vance's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. Arthur Vance stopped, mid-rant. He seemed genuinely bewildered, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken to him. He stared at Isabella, his eyes narrowing. What did you just say to me? I said that is enough, sir, Isabella repeated, her gaze unwavering. It was a minor accident. The young man is terrified. You have made your point. A low murmur rippled through the restaurant. No one spoke to Arthur Vance like that. No one. Liam and Marcus looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a cold, ugly sound. I've made my point. You think you get to decide when I've made my point? He took a step closer to her, invading her personal space, using his height and presence to intimidate. Who in the hell do you think you are? You're a waitress, a nobody. Your job is to take my order and stay invisible. You have no right to an opinion. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. You just made the second biggest mistake of your life. The first was getting out of bed this morning. Now I suggest you and this clumsy oaf get out of my sight before I decide to buy this entire restaurant and fire every last one of you just for the pleasure of it. He smiled then, a predator's smile. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed her. He expected her to flinch. to apologize, to scurry away in fear. Isabella didn't move. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes holding a universe of pain and resolve he could not possibly comprehend. The years of suppressed grief, the quiet anger that had simmered just beneath the surface, the memory of her father's tired face, it all coalesced into a single moment of crystalline clarity. She took a small breath. The entire restaurant, from the bussers in the corner to the socialites at the bar, was frozen, watching, waiting. The silence was absolute. And then she spoke. The air in Aurelia was so thick with tension, it felt like a physical weight. Every diner was a statue. Every member of the staff was a pillar of salt. All of them were caught in the gravitational pull of the confrontation at table 7. Arthur Vance stood, chest puffed out, a triumphant smirk on his face, waiting for the waitress to crumble. Isabella looked directly into his cold, sea-gray eyes. She saw the flicker of victory in them, the satisfaction of a bully who had found a new target. She saw the man who had signed a piece of paper and without a second thought condemned her family. The fury she had buried for 15 years did not erupt in a shout. It was honed, chilled, and forged into a single quiet weapon. She spoke, and her voice, though barely above a whisper, carried to every corner of the silent room with the devastating impact of a bomb. "Mr. Vance," she began, her tone unnerving in its calm politeness, "do you still take your coffee with 2 sugars, just like you did on the morning you signed the eviction notice for the old Rossi Bakery on Elm Street?" Silence. It was no longer just a lack of noise. It was a profound, echoing void. It was the silence of a deep-sea trench, the silence of space. The words hung in the air, shimmering and terrible. The old Rossi Bakery on Elm Street. The sentence was a key turning a lock in a door Arthur Vance had bricked up and forgotten decades ago. It wasn't an accusation. It was a memory, an intimate, specific, and damning detail that could not have been researched. It was a ghost story told in 16 words. The smirk on Arthur Vance's face did not just disappear. It was wiped away, as if by a physical blow. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. His eyes, which moments before had been alight with arrogant fire, now widened in shock and a dawning, horrifying recognition. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, and in the face of the 24-year-old woman in a waitress uniform, he saw the ghost of a proud, flour-dusted baker from Brooklyn. "What did you say?" he breathed, his voice a strangled rasp. "The coffee," Isabella repeated, her voice as steady as a rock in a storm. "2 sugars. You told my father it was the only way you could stomach the swill they served in this part of town. You were wearing a blue tie with gold stripes. You said it was a formality before the bulldozers arrived." The details were like daggers, each one piercing the armor of time and wealth he had built around himself. This wasn't a disgruntled employee. This wasn't a random challenger. This was his past, standing before him, demanding a reckoning. The other diners were completely bewildered. They had no context for the words Rossi Bakery, but they understood the effect. They had just witnessed a public execution. The most powerful man in the room had been brought to his knees by a memory he didn't even know was loaded. Liam and Marcus stared, their mouths agape. Their world was built on a simple hierarchy. Arthur Vance was at the top, and everyone else was below. They had just seen the foundation of their universe crack. Mr. Dubois, who had been moving to intervene, stopped dead in his tracks. He recognized the tone in the waitress's voice. This was no longer a customer service issue. This was something ancient and personal. Arthur Vance staggered back a step, his hand finding the back of his chair to steady himself. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man who could command boardrooms with a word, who could make markets tremble with a press release, was speechless. He was naked, his carefully constructed persona of invincibility shattered into a million pieces on the floor of a restaurant, all because a waitress remembered how he took his coffee. The entire opulent world of Aurelia remained frozen, trapped in the echo of that one life-altering sentence. The lion had been silenced, not by a roar, but by a whisper from his own history. The frozen moment stretched for what felt like an eternity. The silence in Aurelia was so profound that the hum of a wine fridge from across the room sounded like a jet engine. Arthur Vance, the titan of industry, looked utterly broken. His face, usually a mask of imperious control, was a canvas of confusion, shock, and an emotion no one had ever seen on him before. Fear. He finally found his voice, but it was a shadow of its former self, thin and brittle. Who are you? Isabella's gaze didn't waver. My name is Isabella Rossi. Marco Rossi was my father. The name hung in the air between them. Marco Rossi. To Vance, it was a footnote from a bygone era, a minor acquisition in a portfolio of conquests. To Isabella, it was her entire world. Vance flinched as if she had struck him. He looked around the room, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. He saw the curiosity, the pity, the schadenfreude on the faces of his peers. His public image, the carefully curated myth of the untouchable billionaire, was bleeding out on the plush carpet. Humiliation washed over him, followed by a surge of desperate, cornered animal anger. This is ridiculous, he blustered, trying to regain control. He turned to his partners. We're leaving. Liam and Marcus, grateful for an escape, shot up from their chairs. Sir, your bill, Mr. Dubois started, moving forward cautiously. Send it to my office, Vance snapped, not even looking at him. He threw his napkin onto the table and started toward the door, his movements stiff and jerky. He didn't look at Isabella again. He couldn't. But Isabella wasn't finished. As he passed her, she spoke one last time, her voice low and for his ears only. You didn't just take a building, Mr. Vance. You took a life. He stopped for a split second, his back rigid, before continuing his hurried retreat. The exit of Arthur Vance from Aurelia was the complete opposite of his entrance. He didn't consume the room. He fled from it, a diminished figure escaping the scene of his own unraveling. The moment the great oak door closed behind him, the spell broke. The restaurant erupted in a cacophony of hushed, frantic whispers. What was that about? Did you hear what she said? A bakery? I've never seen Arthur Vance look like that. He looked haunted. Leo, who had been a silent, terrified spectator to the whole drama, rushed over to Isabella. Bella, my God, what did you do? Are you okay? Isabella felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. I'm fine, Leo, she said, managing a weak smile. Don't worry about him. He won't be blacklisting you. Mr. Dubois approached, his face a mixture of awe and professional anxiety. He looked at Isabella with entirely new eyes. She was not just a law student working a side gig. She was a woman who had single-handedly brought down a giant. Miss Rossi, he said, his voice formal, my office, now. As Isabella followed him through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the staff parted for her like the Red Sea. The chefs, the bussers, the other servers, they all looked at her with a stunned respect. She had done what none of them had ever dared to do. She had spoken truth to unchecked power. In the cramped, sterile office, Mr. Dubois closed the door. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. You realize, of course, that I should fire you on the spot. Engaging with a guest in such a personal and confrontational manner is a cardinal sin in this business. Isabella met his gaze, her exhaustion replaced by a quiet defiance. I know. Mr. Dubois was silent for a moment, studying her. You also realize, he continued, a faint hint of a smile touching his lips, that what you did was the single most courageous thing I have ever witnessed in my 30 years in this industry. He leaned back against his desk. I'm not going to fire you, Isabella. In fact, I'm giving you the rest of the night off, with full pay, and Leo as well. But you need to tell me what that was about, because I have a feeling that when Arthur Vance's office calls tomorrow, and they will call, I need to know exactly what story I'm a part of. And so, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the manager's office, far from the opulent grandeur of the dining room, Isabella Rossi began to tell her story. She spoke of a warm bakery filled with the scent of anise and almond, of a father who sang opera while he kneaded dough, and of a cold, ambitious man in a blue-striped tie who had taken it all away, leaving a wound that had festered for 15 long years. Arthur Vance didn't go home. Home was a sterile penthouse overlooking Central Park, a place curated by decorators and inhabited by ghosts of forgotten conversations. It offered no comfort tonight. Instead, he retreated to the only place he felt truly himself, his fortress, his temple, the towering headquarters of Vance Global Properties. The ride from Soho to Midtown was a silent, suffocating affair. Liam and Marcus sat in the plush leather seats of the Maybach, stealing frightened glances at their boss. The air was thick with his unexpressed rage and a chilling, unfamiliar scent of defeat. They had witnessed the impossible. Arthur Vance, the architect of their world, had been publicly dismantled. They tried once to break the silence. "That was unbelievable, Arthur," Liam stammered. "That woman, she should be fired. Sued even. We can have our legal team—" "Quiet," Vance commanded. The word was not a shout. It was a shard of ice. It cut the air and froze any further attempts at conversation. For the rest of the ride, the only sound was the slick hum of the tires on wet pavement. When the car pulled into the private underground garage of Vance Tower, Arthur got out without a word, leaving his partners behind like discarded baggage. He strode through the marble lobby, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty space. The night security guard, accustomed to his boss's late hours, nodded respectfully, but Arthur didn't see him. He was seeing a different face, a young woman with old eyes, speaking words that had unmade him. He took the private express elevator to the penthouse floor, the 60-second ride, a journey into the heart of his own desolate kingdom. His office was a masterpiece of corporate power, a desk carved from a single piece of Macassar ebony, a collection of abstract expressionist art worth more than a small country's GDP. And dominating the entire space, a floor-to-ceiling glass wall that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city he had bent to his will. Tonight, the view was an indictment. He walked to the window, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of shattered diamonds. He saw his own reflection superimposed over the metropolis. A man of 63, his silver hair perfectly in place, his $10,000 suit now bearing a faint water stain on the sleeve. But for the first time, he looked past the facade. He saw the faint lines of cruelty etched around his mouth, the cold vacancy in his eyes. He saw the man Isabella Rossi had seen, the man who had destroyed her father. The old Rossi Bakery on Elm Street. He closed his eyes and the memory, buried for a decade and a half under layers of deals and triumphs, rushed back with sickening clarity. He wasn't the titan in the tower then. He was 38, ravenous, eager to make a name for himself that was separate from his inherited wealth. The Brooklyn block was his test case, his chance to prove he had a killer instinct. He remembered the smell of the bakery. It had hit him the moment he'd walked in for that first and only meeting. Not the cloying sweetness of a commercial donut shop, but something rich and ancient. Yeast, anise, roasting almonds, melting chocolate. It was the smell of a home. It had momentarily disarmed him, and that had made him angry. He remembered Marco Rossi, not as a line item, but as a man, strong, proud, with flour in the creases of his knuckles and a stubborn fire in his eyes. He remembered how Rossi had refused to shake his hand, how he had gestured to the pictures on the wall, his father, his grandfather, all standing in this very spot. "This is not a property, Mr. Vance," Rossi had said, his voice thick with an Italian accent. "This is my blood. It is not for sale." Arthur remembered his own response, the words coming back to him now with a sting of shame. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Rossi. It's just a matter of finding the right price or the right pressure." And he remembered the girl. She hadn't been hiding behind her father's legs as he'd vaguely recalled. She had been sitting at a small table in the corner, ostensibly doing her homework, but her dark, serious eyes had never left his face. She had watched his every move, listened to his every word, with a silent, unnerving judgment. He had dismissed her, a child in the periphery of a business transaction. He realized now, with a cold dread that started in his gut and spread through his veins, that he had been the one in the periphery of her story. He was just the villain. She was the protagonist, waiting 15 years for her moment. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his reverie. His executive assistant, Carol, entered, her face etched with professional concern. She had been with him since the beginning, since before the Brooklyn acquisition. She knew where the bodies were buried because she had typed the memos that ordered the shovels. "Sir, is everything all right?" Liam called from the car. He was incoherent. "I'm fine, Carol," he said, his back still to her, his voice hoarse. "The manager from Aurelia, a Mr. Dubois, has called twice," she continued, her tone carefully neutral. "He was very circumspect. He said to inform you that your waitress for the evening, Miss Isabella Rossi, has finished her shift and left the premises." There was a slight pause. "He also passed on a message from her. He said it was important." Arthur finally turned from the window. "What was the message?" Carol held his gaze. "She said to tell you that she does not want your money, that she will not be suing you, and she has no intention of speaking to the press." She took a small breath before delivering the final, devastating line. "She said she only wanted you to remember." The words landed like punches. Not a lawsuit, not a shakedown, not a scandal he could manage with his army of lawyers and PR agents. This was something else entirely. It was a sentence, handed down not in a court of law, but in a court of memory. He was being judged on a moral plane he hadn't visited in decades. He had no power here. His money was worthless. His influence was meaningless. He felt a sudden, desperate need for proof, for tangible evidence of his crime. He needed to see it, to hold it, to understand the mechanics of the destruction he had wrought. He looked at Carol, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Get me the file on the Elm Street acquisition, Project Nightingale, the original one from, it must have been 2010 or 2011. Carol's professional composure finally cracked. A flicker of shock, of understanding, crossed her face. She knew that file. She knew what it represented. "Sir, that's in the deep archives. It will take the overnight team hours, perhaps days, to retrieve it." "I don't care if you have to fly to the facility yourself and blowtorch the lock," Arthur commanded, the old fire returning to his voice. But this time it was fueled not by ambition, but by a desperate need for a reckoning. "I want it on my desk by morning, everything. The proposals, the legal challenges, the community petitions, all of it." Carol simply nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned and left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving him alone once more with his reflection. The confession in the night was over. He had admitted his guilt to himself. Now, with the impending arrival of the file, he knew the trial was about to begin. The 2 days that followed the incident at Aurelia were the longest of Arthur Vance's life. He operated on autopilot, a ghost haunting the opulent shell of his own existence. He attended a board meeting where he stared blankly at profit projections, his mind a million miles away in a dusty, ghost-filled bakery. He took a call with a Japanese consortium about a multi-billion-dollar hotel project, his responses monosyllabic and distant. The titan of industry, the man whose focus was so legendary it was said he could see shifts in the market days before they happened, was adrift in a sea of memory. Sleep offered no escape. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see spreadsheets or architectural renderings. He saw the defiant face of a baker, the accusing eyes of a little girl in a faded photograph, and the calm, devastating gaze of the woman she had become. He heard the sentence over and over again, a phantom whisper in the dead of night. "Do you still take your coffee with 2 sugars?" On the second morning at precisely 5:40 a.m., his executive assistant, Carol, entered his penthouse office. She had been with him for 31 years, a silent witness to his ascent. She knew his moods, his tells, and his secrets better than anyone. She placed a thick, accordion-style folder on his vast mahogany desk. Its cardboard was yellowed with age, the label typed on a machine that was now a museum piece. It read, "Project Nightingale, Elm Street Acquisition, 2010. Nightingale had been the cynical code name for the project that had silenced an entire block of small businesses. "The archives team found it at 3 this morning," Carol said, her voice neutral. She was the only person who dared speak to him without a tremor of fear. They had to retrieve it from the off-site facility in Jersey. Arthur didn't respond. He simply stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. It was the physical manifestation of his original sin. "Arthur," Carol said softly, her use of his first name a rare breach of protocol, reserved for moments of true crisis. Are you going to tell me what this is about? The entire office is whispering. Liam and Marcus look like they've seen a ghost. The story from Aurelia is starting to leak. The details are wrong, of course. They're saying you had a health scare, that a waitress accidentally spilled hot coffee on you. But I know you better than that. You weren't scared. You were something else. He finally looked up at her, and she was startled by the raw exhaustion in his eyes. The predator was gone, replaced by an old, weary man. I was remembered, Carol, he said, his voice a rasp. That's what happened. I was remembered. He dismissed her with a wave, and for the next 8 hours, Arthur Vance did not move from his desk. He opened the file and began to read. It wasn't just a legal record. It was a time capsule of his own ambition. He saw the initial scouting reports, his own handwritten notes in the margins, sharp and dismissive. Sentimental value, not market value, he had scrawled next to a description of the Rossi Bakery. Leverageable, he had written beside a note about an old overlooked zoning clause. He saw the transcripts of the initial negotiations. Marco Rossi's words, though filtered through the dry summary of a lawyer, were full of passion. He spoke of his grandfather, who had opened the bakery, of the generations of families who had celebrated birthdays with his cakes, of the bread that was the heart of the neighborhood. Arthur then read his own lawyer's response, a cold, clinical recitation of legal threats and lowball offers. It was a dialogue between a man trying to save his heart and a machine designed to rip it out. The most damning section contained the community petitions, hundreds of signatures on wrinkled pages, handwritten letters from residents pleading with Vance Global to reconsider. The Rossi Bakery is more than a store, one letter read. It's where I bought the cake for my daughter's wedding. It's where Mrs. Rossi gave my son a free cannoli when he was sad. You can't put a price on that. He had seen these letters back then. He remembered scoffing at them, passing them to his legal team with instructions to handle it. Now each signature felt like a nail being hammered into his conscience. He saw the final eviction notice, a copy of the very paper he had signed that morning 15 years ago. He remembered the coffee. It had been terrible, cheap diner coffee, and yes, he had drowned it in 2 sugars. He remembered the little girl with the dark, watchful eyes. Her name was Isabella. It was all there, in black and white. He finally closed the folder as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office that looked like prison bars. He had built an empire, but what was it worth if its foundation was made of gravestones? You didn't just take a building, you took a life. He now believed it. The file didn't contain a death certificate, but it detailed a murder of the spirit. The next day he summoned his driver. Take me to Brooklyn, he said. Elm Street. The journey was a tour of his own legacy. They drove past Vance Tower, a spire of gleaming arrogance. They crossed a bridge whose renovation was funded by a Vance-backed initiative. His name was everywhere, carved into the very fabric of the city. But as they drove deeper into Brooklyn, the landscape changed. The corporate logos gave way to smaller, independent storefronts, graffiti art, and the vibrant, chaotic energy of real life. This was the world he had once strip-mined for profit. When they arrived at Elm Street, he told his driver to park and wait. He got out of the car, his expensive leather shoes feeling alien on the cracked pavement. The condo building, the Elm View, stood before him. It was handsome in a sterile, modern way. A young woman in yoga pants pushed a stroller out of the automatic glass doors. A dog walker tangled with 3 leashes near the manicured shrubs. It was a perfectly pleasant, perfectly soulless place. He walked to the corner where the bakery had been. The space was now occupied by a minimalist, high-end vegan juice bar. Young people sat staring at laptops, sipping green concoctions from plastic cups. He felt a wave of profound dislocation. He had not just replaced a building, he had replaced a memory. He had bulldozed a piece of the city's soul and replaced it with kale. He spent an hour walking the block, a ghost at a feast he had catered. He saw the faces of the people and wondered what they knew of the history beneath their feet. Nothing. To them, this was just another block. To him, it was now a crime scene. Meanwhile, Isabella Rossi was trying to find her own sense of normalcy. The day after the confrontation, she had called her mother, Elena. She sat on her bed, the phone pressed to her ear, and told her everything, her voice trembling as she recounted the story. On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. then the sound of a soft, choked sob. "You spoke to him?" Elena whispered. "After all these years, you spoke to the man who—" "I did, Ma," Isabella said. "I had to. For Dad." It was a conversation 15 years in the making. They cried together for the husband and father they had lost, for the bitterness they had carried for so long, and for the strange, terrifying release that had come from one moment of impossible courage. The incident solidified something within her. In her torts class that week, as her professor droned on about corporate liability shields and the legal fictions that protect massive companies from the consequences of their actions, she felt a fire ignite in her belly. The law, which had once been an abstract concept, was now a weapon. She had seen how it could be used to destroy. She was now more determined than ever to learn how to use it to build, to protect, to defend the Marco Rosses of the world. A week later, while studying in the law library, a friend slid a tablet in front of her, the screen open to a Wall Street Journal article. "Is this the same guy?" her friend whispered. Isabella read the headline. "Arthur Vance announces the Marco Project, a multi-million-dollar foundation to protect small businesses." She read the article with a dizzying mix of cynicism and shock. The Marco Project. He had used her father's name. Her first instinct was anger. It felt like a public relations stunt, a cynical attempt to launder his reputation using her family's tragedy. He was co-opting their pain, turning it into a tax-deductible act of charity. But as she read on, she saw the specifics. The foundation's charter was incredibly detailed. It targeted the exact legal loopholes and predatory tactics Vance himself had perfected. It was designed to create a shield for the vulnerable, an antidote to the very poison he had spread. It was more than a gesture. It was an act of penance, engineered with the same ruthless precision he applied to his business deals. He was trying to undo the damage, not just for her, but for all the families like hers. The final act came a few days later. A sleek black car pulled up outside her modest apartment building. A woman in an elegant but severe business suit stepped out. It was Carol. She introduced herself simply as a representative of Mr. Vance's office. "Miss Rossi," Carol said, her expression professionally placid, but her eyes full of a deep human curiosity. "I was asked to deliver this to you personally." She handed Isabella a heavy flat box wrapped in simple brown paper. Isabella took it, her hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" "It is a response," Carol said, "and an apology, the only kind he knows how to make." She gave a slight nod and returned to her car, leaving Isabella standing on the sidewalk, holding the package. Back in her apartment, Isabella sat on her sofa and carefully opened the box. The first thing she saw was a silver frame. Inside it was a photograph, restored to pristine condition. It was the newspaper picture of her family in front of the bakery. Her father looked so strong, her mother so hopeful, and she was just a little girl, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Seeing it so clearly, without the faded yellow of age, was like looking through a window into the past. It was beautiful, and it was heartbreaking. Beneath the photograph was a thick legal document, a deed. She read it, her heart pounding. Arthur Vance had legally repurchased the commercial space on the ground floor of the Elmview, the former juice bar. He had dissolved the LLC that owned it and had signed the property over, unencumbered and with all taxes prepaid, into a trust. The sole beneficiary was Isabella Rossi. Tucked into the last page was a simple, heavyweight business card. On it was a handwritten note in sharp, angular script, the handwriting of a man used to signing billion-dollar contracts. It said, "This is not a gift, it is a debt. What you do with it is your business." AV tears streamed down Isabella's face. It wasn't about the money. He understood. He could have sent a check, a settlement, hush money, but he hadn't. He had given her back the one thing he had taken, a piece of her father's land, a piece of their history. That weekend, Isabella and her mother went to Elm Street. They stood together on the sidewalk in front of the Elmview, holding the deed. They looked at the space that was now, impossibly, theirs. "What will we do, Bella?" Elena asked, her voice thick with emotion. We can't bring the bakery back." "No, Ma," Isabella said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "We can't. The world has changed." She looked at the young people walking by, at the new rhythm of the neighborhood. But Dad didn't just love baking. He loved what the bakery was, a place for the community, a place where someone starting out could get a chance. She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile, the first she'd felt in years. "I think," she said, squeezing her mother's hand, "we'll find a new baker, a young family with a dream, maybe some immigrants like Nono was. We won't charge them much rent, just enough to keep the lights on. We'll give them the chance that was stolen from us." They were not rebuilding the past. They were planting a new seed in its soil, creating a new legacy from the ashes of the old one. Arthur Vance had learned that true power wasn't in taking, but in restoring. And Isabella Rossi, standing on the piece of earth that defined her family's loss and now their future, understood that the most powerful sentence isn't always one that ends a story. Sometimes it's the one that allows a new one to begin. The story of Arthur Vance and Isabella Rossi isn't just about a billionaire and a waitress. It's a powerful reminder that every action, no matter how small or how long ago, creates a ripple in the world. It's about the fact that behind every headline, every corporate takeover, every line on a spreadsheet, there are human lives with their own stories, their own hopes, and their own ghosts. Isabella's single sentence did more than silence a restaurant. It bridged a 15-year gap of pain and forced a powerful man to look in the mirror. It teaches us that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest, but about having the courage to speak a quiet truth. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden battles people fight every day, please give this video a like. Your support helps us share more tales like this one. Share it with someone who appreciates stories of courage and redemption. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that uncover the extraordinary and the ordinary. And now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Isabella's place? Let us know in the comments below.